What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast as I'm back again for part 2 of tonight's show. And obviously, I just wrapped up the NFL trade deadline. What went down? Jay moving from the Dolphins to the Eagles. Jimmy Garoppolo moving on from the Patriots to the San Francisco 49ers. And last but not least, the Buffalo Bills acquiring Kelvin Benjamin from the Carolina Panthers. I am so shocked that the Bills were able to make these moves throughout the course of the trade deadline, alleviating themselves of Marcel Darius and acquiring Kelvin Benjamin. But moving on, the other side of the coin, as I like to call it, the mixed martial arts world, we get a big fight card on Saturday, November 4th, UFC 217. Michael the Count Bisping, George Rush St. Pierre makes his return after a 4-year hiatus. And in the co-main event, you have Cody Garbrandt versus the rival TJ Dillashaw. Rose Namajunas challenging Joanna Jędrzejczyk for the women's strawweight title. 3 title fights in one night. It's going to be a barn burner. It's going to be an epic night of fights. And in case you don't know, the Thomas Take will be live from 2 to 4 as I'm joined by my good buddy, one of my best friends, Eric Ellis. If anybody knows how I debate sports, there is one guy that has debated sports with me more than just about anybody. It is Eric Ellis. So I'm very happy to have him on the show. And obviously, we'll be having on David Poole Jr., who's joined me from time to time as a co-host on the show. And my Fantasy Sports Talk mixed martial arts writer Orlando Torres, good buddy of mine that I join ever so often on the My Fantasy podcast. So thank you all for joining me tonight as I count down the second edition of the Fab Five. In this edition of the Fab Five, I'll be chronicling the greatest of all time, in my humble opinion, George Rush St. Pierre. The Fab Five represents the 5 best wins of George St. Pierre's career. So, I started the first edition of this show with Michael Bisping, the Fab Five, last night. And with Michael Bisping, it was fairly easy to pick his 5 wins. I mean, if you really are a diehard MMA fan, you could assume what was the number 1 win. Maybe not. But if you're a real diehard fan like I am, you can assume what was the number 1 win. But in the case of George St. Pierre, throughout his illustrious, career of being a champion for 6 years, defending the belt time and time again, it was very tough for me to pick his best win. But I'm going to start out with Mambo number 5, as I always like to call number 5. I'm going to start out with the fight in which George St. Pierre won the UFC welterweight title the first time. Most people don't realize George St. Pierre was a 2-time UFC welterweight champion. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but it started with Matt Hughes, a TKO head kick punches victory, where that was 11 years ago, November 18th, 2006, in Sacramento, California. It was the fight in which GSP won the UFC welterweight title. Most people will probably listen to this and say, I picked the fight in which he won the title for the first time as his 5th most impressive win. Yes. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later. It was the second fight between GSP and Matt Hughes. So, that being said, moving on to the 4th best fight in GSP's career. And this was a fight in which he avenged a loss. GSP had beaten Matt Hughes in 2006, lost to Matt Serra in devastating upset fashion in April of 2007 at UFC 69 versus Matt Serra, rebounded with 2 victories over Josh Koscheck, 1 over Matt Hughes again, which was a verbal armbar tap with 4 minutes and 54 seconds into the second round. Finished. The fight ended in GSP winning the UFC interim welterweight title. and then he finally faced off with Matt Hughes in April of 2008, 1 year later. And the fourth most impressive fight, in my humble opinion, is GSP defeating Matt Serra via TKO, knees to the body. And this was the fight that started the second reign, the real reign of the UFC welterweight title. The third win that I find most impressive in terms of the record of George St. Pierre, the third win, this is in his title reign, a win that I think really goes highly unnoticed, and that was a win over Jake Shields at UFC 129, April 30th, 2011. Jake Shields, and that's my birthday, by the way, in case anybody wants to send me a birthday card with some money in it, preferably. Jake Shields was a guy that was a world-renowned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, obviously knowing how impressive GSP is in the wrestling department, and more in particularly on the ground as a top position fighter. Jake Shields was a very, very tough task, a guy that was thought to be the toughest fight of George St. Pierre's career. GSP took him down, I think, 10 or 11 times, neutralized him, controlled him, avoided the submission, and just battered Jake Shields in Toronto. And I picked this fight as the third most impressive fight in GSP's career because this was the first fight that really generated a large audience in UFC history. This was at the Rogers Center in Toronto, Canada, in front of 55,000 people, a card that was co-headlined by Jose Aldo taking on Mark Hominick. This was a big deal at the time, a big card in the history of MMA, UFC 129, in which George St. Pierre fought Jake Shields to a unanimous decision victory. So I got to recap the fifth most important fight, the fifth Fab Five fight, Matt Hughes, the fourth, Matt Serra, in which he avenged his loss to Matt Serra and avenged his loss to Matt Hughes. And then the third most impressive fight was versus Jake Shields. The next most impressive fight, in my opinion, was a fight in which GSP, the second most impressive fight of GSP's career, GSP coming off a win versus Jake Shields, his next opponent in November of 2012, so a big gap in between these two fights for GSP. GSP tears his knee in training for Carlos Condit. I think it was around July or August they were slated to fight. GSP tore his knee and did not fight him for another year, in which Carlos Condit was coming off a victory over Nick Diaz for the UFC interim title. They merged the titles at UFC 154. George St. Pierre defeated Carlos Condit, and I have this as his second most impressive victory because of the fact that GSP faced severe adversity in this fight from Carlos Condit. Carlos Condit, in my time of watching mixed martial arts, has been one of the most underrated fighters in UFC history. The natural-born killer, a guy that has finished the majority of his opponents inside the UFC, was so close to finishing GSP at UFC 154 through a awkward head kick, turning left head kick, that GSP just did not see coming, that dropped GSP, and Carlos was unable to finish him. But GSP, hanged in there, stayed tough with Carlos Condit, and for that reason, I have that as his second most impressive fight in his UFC career. UFC 94, the most impressive win that George St. Pierre has ever accrued during his UFC career. UFC 94, GSP versus BJ Penn, not one, but two. It was billed as an epic battle of champions, where George St. Pierre entered the bout as obviously the UFC welterweight champion. BJ Penn entered the bout as the UFC lightweight champion, as the UFC looked to merge the titles. And really, everything was on the line for GSP. BJ Penn was looking to reclaim the title that was once his as a UFC welterweight champion, defeating Matt Hughes back in the day. Realistically, GSP getting the title was due in large part to the fact that BJ Penn was not around BJ Penn left the UFC due to contract negotiations stalling out, fought in Japan, fought all around the world, fought in Pride at the time, and that led to Matt Hughes and GSP having that rivalry. And then things came full circle here with GSP versus Penn 2, and the first fight with St. Pierre and Penn was virtually to go up against Matt Hughes for the UFC welterweight title. This time, it was a champion versus champion fight. The first fight between St. Pierre and Penn was a split decision victory. So, to date, to this point in 2009, this was the toughest competitor that GSP had ever faced. BJ Penn was in his prime. BJ Penn was one of the most, shall I say, unbelievable champions, as well as BJ Penn. Two of the best fighters in the world at the time, pound for pound, going up against each other in one fight. This was a huge deal. The first of only 2 occasions in which the UFC put on a champion versus champion fight, and the second one being most recently at UFC 205 with Eddie Alvarez and Conor McGregor. So I feel like I'm kind of being a UFC encyclopedia, so to speak, but this was the real reality of the situation. This was a huge deal at the time, and for that very reason, I have this as the most impressive win of GSP's career, in which he defended the UFC welterweight championship versus the UFC lightweight champion. Not only did he defend it, but BJ Penn was forced to quit in the 4th round. It was a technical knockout, a corner stoppage. The beating that GSP put on BJ Penn was unlike anything we have ever seen, and that really began a unfortunate downward spiral for the prodigy BJ Penn. So, UFC 94, definitely his most impressive win, and it was so tough for me to go through his career and nitpick kind of which victories were most impressive. This is a guy that is, in my opinion, the best champion that the UFC has ever had. He had lost his title to Matt Serra, regained it with wins off of Josh Koscheck, Matt Hughes, and then defeating Matt Serra for the title. After the Matt Serra fight, in which he lost, GSP has went on a 11-fight win streak, defeating guys by the names of, obviously, Josh Koscheck twice, Matt Hughes twice, Matt Serra, John Fitch, BJ Penn, Thiago Alves, Dan Hardy, Jake Shields, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, and last but not least, Johnny Hendricks, which was a very tough fight, but a fight that I did have GSP winning in the end. So a truly remarkable career that is somewhat restarted. Chapter 2, or Chapter 3, I should say. Actually Chapter 2, because this is his first fight in the UFC middleweight division, which GSP will be fighting Michael Bisping Saturday night in the main event for the UFC middleweight title. One of the greatest careers that the sport of MMA has ever seen, one of the greatest champions that the sport of MMA has ever seen, in my opinion, the greatest fighter in UFC history, really did it the right way, represented the sport the right way, wasn't a insulting trash talker. He was a consummate professional, a true athlete, brought a dynamic to the sport that we had not seen yet, and that has definitely blossomed into many, many other forms of fighting and forms of fighters coming into the UFC with more athleticism than just true grit, and that has made the sport at a new level. He really raised the bar for everybody else. So that was my countdown, the Fab Five in the career of George St. Pierre, as George St. Pierre looks to do something that only 3 UFC fighters have done before him: win 2 belts in 2 different weight classes. Could he do it? Can he do it? I think he can. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I'm going to go with GSP, but I will talk more about my prediction for the fight on the live UFC 217 pre-fight show, live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as I'm joined by Eric Ellis, Orlando Torres, and David Poole Jr. That was the Thomas Take. George St. Pierre, the Fab Five. Thank you so much for tuning in, and enjoy the fights Saturday night, November 4th. I know I will.